Hey YouTube, this is Archangel for Truth, and today my video is talking to you about driving or traveling as a right and not as a privilege. This is a very important topic because there is much confusion, and this video will be for the purpose of clarifying some of that confusion. And so ultimately, in order for us to really determine whether or not driving or traveling is a right or a privilege, we need to understand, where do our rights come from? So that's the question we really need to examine. Think about it. Where do our rights come from? Do they come from the government? Or did our rights exist even before the government existed? Well, if you said that our rights existed before the government existed, you would be correct. So, if that is the case, that our rights existed before the government existed, then we do indeed have a right to drive. Now, this is important because many people believe that we only have rights that the government says that we have rights. And this is not true. Consider, when the Constitution was written, it entailed certain rights that we have, certain freedoms that we have. The freedom of speech. Let's start off with the freedom of speech. Did we have the right, the freedom of speech, before the Constitution was written? Or did that right only become established as a result of the Constitution? You see, obviously, we had the right. So the question comes then, are our rights only limited to those listed by the Constitution? The answer is no. We have far more rights than are listed by the Constitution. And so we have what is called the Bill of Rights. And the Ninth Amendment is on the Bill of Rights. And what the Ninth Amendment is talking about is those rights not listed by the Constitution. It calls those rights unenumerated rights. The reason why it does is because they're not numerated or numbered by the Constitution. And so ultimately, we have an unlimited amount of rights not listed in the Constitution. They're inherent to our humanity, a gift from our loving Creator, inalienable, natural rights. So now that we know that our rights do not come from the government, can the government deny us our rights, even if they're not enumerated? Well, again, we go back to the Ninth Amendment, and it clearly stipulates that these unenumerated rights shall not be denied, nor shall they be disparaged, regardless of whether it's the federal government or the state. So ultimately, again, you have rights that are not listed, that are not yet recognized by the government, but nevertheless, you have them. And if the government should choose to deny or disparage these rights, then ultimately they would be in violation of the Bill of Rights and the Constitution. So it's very important that you understand that and make that connection. So, where did this idea come from that driving is a privilege? It wasn't established by the Senate, and that's very important. Because, for example, the Supreme Court can only make decisions on laws that were already established by the Senate. So the Senate makes up the laws, and then ultimately the Supreme Court interprets those laws. And they can't make the laws themselves. So again, if they did, that would interfere with the separation of powers. That is not the duty of the Supreme Court to ultimately make up laws. Okay? So, even though the Senate may make up varying laws, even the Senate cannot violate your rights, whether they be enumerated or unenumerated. So, again, I ask the question, where did this idea come from that driving is a privilege? So, since the Senate did not codify it or establish it as being a privilege, what you have is agencies that are used by the varying states to carry out certain authority for the state. So, for example, the Department of Motor Vehicles, or also the Department of Transportation, are what ultimately have established what is called the vehicle codes. And so it was they who determined that driving was a privilege. It wasn't done by the Senate, and therefore it was done by these agencies. And it is repeated by law enforcement. So you'll get a police officer that will come up to your window and tell you, driving isn't a right, it's a privilege. Ah! He's wrong. It is a right. It is a Ninth Amendment unenumerated right. And therefore, ultimately, the states may not deny it or disparage the right. Now, it's important for you to understand what I'm about to say. Even though it is a right, the Supreme Court has made rulings on states' abilities to regulate certain rights. So, what do I mean by this? So, for example, in the case of your Second Amendment right, you have the right to keep and bear arms. And this is an individual right. And so, ultimately, the state, varying states with varying regulations, determine certain limitations on maybe certain guns or ammunition capacities and so forth. That is part of that regulating. Now, that being said, the state then cannot simply deny or disparage or infringe upon your right. Now, they can regulate, but they cannot deny it. The same is true with driving. Driving is indeed a right. It is a regulatable right, but nonetheless, it is a right. So when I say regulated, what I'm talking about is the requirement to stop for stop signs and maybe certain limitations on what speeds there are or how fast a car, automobile, vehicle, whatever you want to call it, is able to go. So ultimately, you have the right, but you have certain safety requirements. So these are common sense things that will help the safety of all if properly done. But that being said, the state does not have the right to then demand you pay some sort of fee in order for you to exercise that right. So, if I use another example, your freedom of speech, you have the right to speak, and though there are certain limitations put upon your speech, for example, you can't shout, "There's a bomb in a crowded room," or another example is you would have certain limited speech in a courtroom. So, again, you have the right, but ultimately, again, there are certain regulatory limitations. And so that is to be expected. But when the state has converted your right into a privilege, it is doing so for the very purpose of profiting off of the right. So, for example, just imagine the revenue that the state builds by registration, by licensing, by traffic fines, and so forth. All these go into the state coffers, and ultimately, it gives the state a reason to call your right a privilege. It's not a privilege. The state has simply converted it into a privilege just so it can charge you these varying fines and fees and so forth. And so by their doing that, they are an actual violation of the Ninth Amendment. They are denying and disparaging you from freely exercising your right. Remember that our rights were not given to us by the government. We chose to make a government for the purpose of protecting our rights, not for giving us the rights that we already had. So if anyone says to the contrary, "Oh, you don't have a right to drive," they're lying. They're misleading you, and it's only because the agencies of the DMV, the Department of Transportation, these are agencies of the state, as well as the police department, have all decided that they're going to profit off of your ability to move around by means of a vehicle, and so they have called it a privilege. That is the truth. Anyone saying otherwise is lying to you, and it is for the purpose of the state's building revenue and using it in such a way. I guarantee you, you take that away from the states are going to have a hard time with their revenue, because they've depended upon this revenue source for so long that it has become very important for them to keep it. And that is why they continue to find varying ways in which they can regulate your rights away. So, again, if you have any comments, I'm not going to leave comments available for this one, because I really want people to be able to not be misled by individuals who would mislead people and say, oh, driving is not a right. It is a right. It is a Ninth Amendment right. There is no Supreme Court case out there that says that driving is not an unenumerated right, despite whatever individuals will say. So I hope that you will take the time to like this video and share this. If you disagree with this video, you're free to comment on any of my other videos, and you may do so. And I will certainly try to respond to you as best as I can, but I get sometimes bombarded by many individuals wanting to say, no, it's not a right, and this and that. Well, you know what? These people are liars. They have a vested interest in keeping you enslaved. And so the truth is that we have rights that existed long before this government did, and this government doesn't give us our rights. So with that, I'm going to close it here, and I wish you all well, and God bless you, and take care.